South Africa has been denied exemption from U.S. steel and aluminium tariffs. Top trade officials have spent weeks trying to win over the Trump administration, but to no avail. Senator Chris Coons, who deals with African affairs, says he is concerned about the impact of the tariffs on South Africa. He spoke to our Washington correspondent, Ryntjes.
We had a whole series of encouraging and inspiring meetings with Minister Gordhan, with Minister Mkhize, with several members of the Constitutional Court, with members of civil society. And I'm encouraged that South Africa, a robust, promising young democracy, has taken a significant step forward. I think President Cyril Ramaphosa and the sort of new cabinet, mostly new cabinet, of folks who are being returned to government, like Minister Gordhan, will turn the corner in terms of their economy. He's committed to revitalizing and investing in the state-owned enterprises that play a really significant role in the South African economy. And I think they will be able to attract the sort of foreign investment, foreign partnership that they're looking for, and to return towards a process where tenders are considered fair and open and predictable. This has been a very challenging decade for South Africa. They've been downgraded to junk bond status. Their currency has taken a huge hit. Their economy has taken a huge hit, and they are now in the process of recovery. That recovery begins with the restoration of confidence, both internally, regionally, and globally, that this is a well-governed republic.
But are you concerned that the imposition of steel and aluminium tariffs on the country, which is so reliant still on the mining sector, could actually cause more harm than good?
I am concerned about that as a, I think, unintended consequence of President Trump's announced tariffs on steel and aluminum. And I've committed to the South Africans we met with, including the minister, that I would raise this issue with the administration. Ways in which that will impact South Africa's developing economy and South Africa's close and growing partnership with the United States were probably not taken into account when that decision was made.
And how's that engagement going? Have you managed to get through to the Trump administration on this issue?
Let's say it's a work in progress. There's other things that I've also suggested they could do that would further open our market to South African citrus exports, for example, that I think would be an important sign of good faith. South Africa is an incredibly robust economy with great promise, where the United States is well regarded. There's 600 American firms that have a presence on the ground in South Africa. We've got a lot of investment there, and we've got a lot of opportunity there. But we need to take advantage of this moment by showing that we're going to treat South Africa in a fair and appropriate basis.
And do you have confidence that the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa at this interim stage is going to be a presidency that is well supported by the Trump administration more generally?
Lots of other countries around the world, China, Brazil, Turkey, our EU partners, are well represented in South Africa and Zimbabwe and seeking opportunities. The United States needs to step up its game if we're going to contribute to the future of South Africa.
And Ryntjes now joins us live from Washington for more on this. Daniel, South Africa held several meetings with U.S. officials seeking to be exempted from the tariffs. What reasons has the Trump administration given for denying them that request?
Well, the Trump administration generally has put forward this argument that the competitive nature of the steel and aluminium industries worldwide puts a national security vulnerability in there. The reason they've raised that national security argument is because when you go to the WTO and argue the point, if you have a national security reason for something, it's very hard for other nations to then challenge the notion of national security rather than, market competitiveness. So it's unclear how you would argue that South African exports represent a national security threat, but that's essentially what's being done.
Right, and I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, that point about the imports from South Africa, because we know the steel exports from South Africa to the U.S. make up a very small portion compared to the total inputs by the U.S. In fact, the South African government has put its total aluminium exports to the U.S. at 1.6% and steel at 0.3%. So question is, Daniel, how much would these imports really hurt the American metal sector?
Well, it wouldn't really hurt them very much. So in the first instance, those who use as South African steel in their supply chain could choose to continue to buy off South Africa even with the tariff, or they could, which is probably what's going to happen, go to those countries not subject to these tariffs that have negotiated these exemptions. And then in the longer term, they could simply choose to ramp up domestic production. So it's very unclear how South Africa is damaging, given those low numbers to the US industry as a whole, how it's damaging US national security.
So recently, Daniel, the US pushed South Africa to accept its poultry exports under AGOA. And this was, of course, despite the fact that the local lobby groups in South Africa claimed that these exports were hurting the local poultry sector. So shouldn't the same rules apply for South Africa in this case?
Well, as you know, we provided extensive coverage of that issue. And essentially what it is that, Americans were not getting almost any of their agricultural products into South Africa. So they used the AGOA issue, the prospect of potentially pulling South Africa out of AGOA as a point of leverage. And in the end, what they did was negotiate a compromise. So there were quotas on American agricultural products, namely poultry, pork and beef, that were allowed to go into the South African market, but at the same time they weren't too high so that the South African producers weren't overexposed, as it were, to the potential to be essentially bought out by a very competitive US market. This is a very different kettle of fish altogether. And I think the arguments coming from Senator Coons and others are that, why would you go and alienate the South Africans at a time when the South African economy is gaining traction, gaining confidence in terms of economic governance, and provides an opportunity for American countries to participate in that growing confidence?
Right, and like you mentioned, Senator Coons did in fact talk about South Africa's economy. And so how is that likely to be impacted by these tariffs?
Well, actually, I think it's fairly substantial. What these South Africans have been doing is playing down the impact on the US economy, but that doesn't mean that the impact on the South African economy is low. In fact, they've already said that the steel tariffs alone could hit roughly 7,500 jobs. If you factor in aluminium tariffs, you could say maybe another 2,500 direct jobs in the supply chain. But that doesn't take into account the fact that these jobs then produce other jobs in the South African economy. So a few weeks ago, Michael McDermott, a professor at Georgetown University Business School, said that it probably will impact about 100,000 jobs in total. So that's over $1 billion of business. That is substantial, especially in such a sensitive sector.
Right, so what options are there for South Africa at this point, or is this really basically a closed case?
The South African Department of Trade and Industries indicated that its main strategy now will be to reach out to those customers that it has in the United States who can make their own case to the US Department of Commerce and say, look, our industries are going to be harmed if we don't have access to this South African product. It's a complex set of negotiations going on here in Washington. It's a chaotic environment. These are very, very short time frames to be negotiating. There are many players. It's hard to lobby Washington. So it's unclear how much traction the South Africans have at this point.
All right, Daniel, we appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much for those insights. Daniel Ryntjes for us there in Washington.